Thank you, everyone. This is a great crowd here. I'm Marjorie Sims with Ascend at the Aspen Institute and want to welcome you. But there are a number of people that are standing in the back, and there's an overflow room in the next room behind you. If you'd like a nice, comfortable seat, you can go there. But if you'd like to be in the main room, please feel free to stay here. So I'm going to now turn it over to Ann Mosley, who's a vice president at the Aspen Institute and the executive director of Ascend. Ann.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Aspen Forum on Children and Families. We're delighted to have everybody here. The positive energy, the connecting that's already happening is just really feels great. And so thank you all for making the trip to be here. I'm going to go sort of typical Ann, say for anybody who's in the back that would like to, is comfortable sitting, feel free to come join in the front. It's actually totally comfortable. I see Kirsten, you come sit in the front. She's going to do it. But come sit on the sides. But, we got a huge demand for people to participate in this conversation. And part of it, I think, was because you can sit right up here, Kirsten. But we had planned this quite a while ago because we knew that there was so much really good momentum that was happening in communities, at the state level, at the federal level, in families, in foundations, people coming together to really think about whole family development and think about especially the two-generation approach, really working with children and their parents and the adults in their lives together. So we move forward. It is a wild world out there. It is unpredictable. It's slightly unprecedented. Probably like each of you, I'm still struggling to keep up with all of the emails or tweets that I read. But I think one of the lessons that I always cling to when I think about when there's such dynamic change and big conversations and possibilities coming up is to be really clear about what you know is foundational and what you know that is negotiable or is just going to be movable. And the leadership in this room is foundational. We have so much positive talent, brain, strategies. I am heartened for us all to come together and think about how we're moving forward. So just quickly, who's in the room? This is a very diverse group of folks. Typically with Ascend at the Aspen Institute, it's not surprising to have policy, practice, research, families, community leaders, philanthropists, business leaders. Well, that's who's in the room today. We have folks that have flown in on their own dime from 85 states. I think my Hawaiian friends, aloha, win the greatest. I don't know if Alaska's made it. Tennessee's got a big turnout in numbers, maybe Tennessee or Colorado. But aloha and mahalo. Oh, shoot. Love that. Oh my God, so good. So good. So 85.
I'm repeating it. It'll be a new fact.
And they're all registered to vote for children and families. Thank you so much. Yes, no, we actually do kind of like facts. So 85 people from leaders from 37 states. Thank you. Well done. Well done. We're excited to have folks across the early childhood spectrum, post-secondary, workforce, human services, health, housing, economic assets, really across the board. We also are very pleased that we have Republicans, Democrats, and independents in this room. This is a bipartisan conversation. So at the risk of just stating the obvious coming in here, we know that it was a razor-thin election. We know that, again, we tested sort of electoral college of popular vote. At the end of the day, 77,744 votes from 3 states, Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, kind of sealed the deal on how this went. So we're balancing this, but yet we have this construct of power. Frankly, if it was either party being so dominant, puts us into somewhat of a challenging environment. And so I think the kind of leadership and vision in this room is needed more than ever. I'll talk a little bit later, but about the rationale behind this forum. We really wanted to be very intentional that it was focused on where we saw opportunity, momentum, and bipartisanship. The Aspen Institute way of convening, as many of you know, we like to talk about values. We like history. We do like facts. I'll get back on. We also really believe in dialogue. And I think one of the lessons that really came out of this election was how do we also listen, not just sort of speak. And so how do we, in these conversations, hopefully both do a lot of sharing, but also a lot of listening. And so throughout the next 2 days, I really encourage you to reach out to someone who you might not know from the 87th state or from Hawaii or from DC and connect with them, because this will hopefully be a slightly different conversation than the many other ones that you're going to be a part of. And that was very intentional. At Senate the Aspen Institute, I'm proud to say we're 6 years old this month. We're relatively new, young. I don't know, my dear colleague Shirley Brandeman, who's the Commission for Social, Emotional, and Academic Achievement, taking on development, sorry, is probably one of the newer programs, but we've been here 6 years, and it's been quite a ride with all of you as we've built a national network, a fellowship program, a policy agenda that is really informed by the voices and expertise of families, by research and data, by best and promising practice, and most importantly, by you at the front lines. And so we're now 170 organizations that are members of the network, including our fellows. We are in 45 states, strong and deep. So by the end of the week, we'll be at 5. Sarah Haight will kill me. But again, we really want to look at how do we have these kind of relationships at the national and at the community and state level. Lastly, sort of as we're kicking it to go into the program, this event is being live streamed. We are excited that there are house viewing parties in Maine up at the Caring Community Collaborative. Senator Collins was thrilled about that. We know there's one in Central New Mexico Community College that Senator Heinrich is really excited about. There's one happening in Indianapolis with the Mayor, Goodwill, Nurse Family Partnership, and the Excel Center, which I know Vice President Pence is thrilled about. And so we're trying to extend this conversation, so while you're here, be tweeting, be sharing. You have social media sheets. I want to thank our social media ambassadors, the National Black Child Development Institute, LIFT, and I think I might be forgetting one, which will remind you, you'll get a shout out in a second. But when you look at the kind of change that we're seeing in the momentum, it's happening at the state level. And we're excited that you're going to be hearing a state panel tomorrow. We're excited about our partnership with the National Governors Association and also CLASP, which are also doing a deliberate strategy around 2-generation approaches at the state level. And it's also nice to see some work happening on the ground. And so just in New York City, 2 leaders that are here that I think are representing some fantastic momentum. One would be Lynn Applebaum. Don't know where Lynn is. Rock on, Lynn. But she is leading an effort at the United Neighborhood Houses, which is the largest network of settlement houses in New York, to really bring the platforms of early childhood and workforce together and take that holistic approach. And so it's millions of families are going to be touched by that work, and we're excited to see that platform take off. I'm also really delighted to see our dear friend Rahil Briggs, who is leading some extraordinary work at Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, where she's piloting both doing an assessment and treatment on maternal health for mothers at the same time and paid for with the child well-being visit, bringing mother's health and child's health together. Just a couple of the examples that we're seeing of where there's momentum of people coming together. So as we go forward, it is going to be a dynamic world. It's going to be important to move forward together. We will have different ideas, we will have different strategies, and we might not always agree. But if all of us in this room share the North Star of putting children and families first, and for us, that really means we focus very laser-like on children and families up to 200% of the federal poverty level, so taking that lens of low income. We think about the disparities around race and ethnicity. We think about it in terms of geography, community, and context. And we also absolutely think about it as a strength-based approach. But that we all share a common star towards that. So how are we trying to make sure we align our efforts? So my watchwords as we go through the next 2 days are focus, collaborate, listen, and partner. So it's my delight to make an introduction of a very special friend, partner, and colleague, Mike Bezos, who I can't think of anybody who embodies those qualities of focus, collaboration, listening, and partnership more than Mike. Mike and his fabulous partner, collaborating, Jackie Bezos. Mike and Jackie Bezos have been incredible pioneers, instigators, supporters to really build a movement around early learning and early childhood. They are part of the Aspen Institute family, and they're part of the Ascend world. Mike is a father, a grandfather, a philanthropist, an engineer, and so much more. We are extraordinarily proud that he is a trustee of the Aspen Institute. So it is my delight to introduce you, Mike, and again, on behalf of the trustees and the leadership, to welcome people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. It's a pleasure to be here in such a wonderful company of folks that are committed to supporting the well-being of children and family. And welcome to the Aspen Institute. For nearly 7 decades, the Aspen Institute has worked to bring diverse people together to examine complex issues, share ideas, and identify common ground, always emphasizing nonpartisanship, value-based leadership qualities, and promoting the exchange of ideas. While the work of the Aspen Institute has grown significantly over these years, now including many public programs, the annual Aspen Ideas Festival, the global leadership offerings, the youth and engagement programs, and more than 30 policy programs, the Institute remains focused on building a brighter future for people around the world. The Bezos Family Foundation began working with the Institute many years ago because of our shared belief that education is a fundamental right. Our foundation also holds a deep commitment to creating opportunities for young people to create ideas of critical interest to them on local and global issues. Years ago, I remember having a conversation with Walter Isaacson about the need to bring more young people into the orbit of the Aspen Institute. We did have to clarify for him that when we meant young people, we were not talking about the 30, 40-year-olds. We were talking about high schoolers. And I can share with you that Walter jumped on that idea right away. So this conversation that we had inspired the foundation's first youth leadership program, which infused the youth voice into the Aspen Ideas Festival. Today, I'm proud to say that our partnership with the Institute continues to focus on expanding leadership opportunities to prepare more young people for success in school and life by engaging them in the discussion, the debate, and development of real solutions for today's complex social problems, while supporting their adults in their lives at the same time. Each of us, everyone in this room and those watching remotely, bring unique perspectives and talents to offer, all of which are important and all of which are needed. Over the next 2 days, together we will explore one of the greatest challenges and opportunities facing our country, improving the lives of our nation's underserved children and families, the families that care for these children. We will hear some of our nation's best ideas and models from the work taking place on the ground that demonstrate what's possible, and this couldn't be timely. As a policy program of the Aspen Institute, Ascend is well positioned to bring together people from all sectors to ensure both children and their families have access to quality education, health, and economic support. Ascend takes a strength-based approach to supporting families by focusing on the assets communities already have and leveraging parent and practitioner voices to make large systems more innovative, efficient, and effective. As each of you know, the need for this work is urgent. In the United States, 45% of children live in low-income families, and only a fraction have access to early childhood services. While we all agree that more must be done to make these families' lives healthier, the path to success is not always as clear. Thankfully, there is a growing body of scientific evidence that affirms the way forward. If we want to help children thrive, we need to help their parents achieve stability through increased access to education, health services, economic support, social connections, and very importantly, strengthening relationships with their children while empowering and validating their parental role. It has been encouraging to see the national growth within the philanthropic sector in support of the two-generation approach through Aspen and other organizations. This effort needs to continue in order to support the scaling of impactful two-gen solutions and to encourage the development of new, innovative approaches. The two-gen concept has gathered broad support here in Washington as policymakers across the political spectrum discuss the need for bold solutions that help both working families and children. As we all know, the first step for developing this meaningful solution is to go straight to the source, to the parents, the teachers, the child care providers, civic leaders, and other local community officials who are the best positioned with the appropriate knowledge and insight to create change. In many ways, our job is to ensure that they have the right information and resources in order for them to act. Over the course of this forum, we will hear from many of these parents and other local leaders who will share with us their powerful stories of resilience and success. You will hear about innovative progress made at the state and community level, which can inform and inspire broader policy change. By listening to each other and grounding our collective efforts in regional and community-based approaches, we can create a culture shift that dramatically improves outcomes for children and families in need. But this will only happen if we stay the course, if we remain persistent and creative in bringing forth what we know from science to be true, that early experiences matter, and if left unattended, we will have a negative impact on health outcomes, economic outcomes, and educational outcomes. My ask of those of you in the room and those listening, joining us remotely, is to remain bold and action-oriented. We each have a unique role to play in ensuring that all children and families succeed. Let's all agree to double down on this work, and to the maximum extent possible, let's cooperate and work together. Thank you for joining us during these next few days and for the dedication that you bring to this critically important work. Thank you, and enjoy it.
Mike, thank you for the perfect remarks to get us started. I think bold, actionable collaboration. So we're about to move into our next panel, and before we go, I just wanted to call your attention to the report that is hot off the press, and it's going to be on live as well as with some accompanying pieces. But it's a report called Placing Children and Families at the Center, Policy Ideas and Recommendations for Leaders at, and we started actually with community, state, and federal, looking at where there's action and opportunity. We're going to be doing a much more deep dive discussion on it tomorrow morning as we kick off, but I just wanted to pull that out so you can take some time to review that sort of this afternoon or tonight. Many of you, you'll see the insert in the back of all the thank yous. It was a hugely collaborative process, which we'll share a bit more about the process and what we learned. Because I think as we do this work, and it's always been sort of a signature style for Ascend at the Aspen Institute, but how to always be thinking outside in versus what's your idea out, and how to be thinking about what's happening in the field from different perspectives. And so as we think about our next panel that we're going to do, it's really about listening to parents, and what are we hearing from parents, and also the public. We have, since we were created sort of back in 2011, getting off the ground, one of the first things we did was commission a set of focus groups to go directly and hear from mothers and fathers that were low income, from diverse race and ethnic backgrounds, to hear what were on their minds. Connecting, economic opportunity, strong families, strong communities, education, health, but to always work and engage. We've gone through periodically going back and doing that touchstone to check ourselves, to listen. We also do that through the partnerships in the network and also working closely with a lot of our parent ambassadors and just colleagues in the field. But I'm really grateful, especially to Celinda Lake of Lake Research and Brian Nienaber from the Tarrance group, who worked as a bipartisan team to really both conduct, but then review in different ways they tap their expertise about what messages did we really hear from the parents. On this one, we focused on low-income parents, but of young children up to age 5, and then also of young parents. As you can see, a theme, if there's a radiating circle of impact, but if we can invest early, the younger, the better. From birth to 3, young mothers, young fathers, but it heads on out. But to do a deep dive with that, and then also get a sort of a sense of the pulse of the public. So if I can invite Celinda and Brian to come up to the stage. And Kristen Grimm, who is going to be moderating. Kristen, I'm going to officially give you the car keys in but 1 second. Kristen Grimm has been a phenomenal partner with us as the CEO of Spitfire and also a Crown Fellow here at the Aspen Institute, and many other sort of accolades with her name. She's going to guide this conversation. I also am delighted to invite my good friend and colleague of many, many years, Ralph Smith, to come on up to join the stage, and also Robert Doar. Robert Doar has been a new friend and colleague that we've been tracking his ideas and his team's work over at the American Enterprise Institute. He serves there as the Morgridge Policy Fellow. But Robert has been someone who also is working on big ideas, but I have great respect for the fact that he's also worked on putting big ideas into action while serving in the Human Services Directorship on the ground in New York City. So I think that always brings a certain sense of like a reality check on what you're doing. Ralph Smith, who's had a very distinguished career in philanthropy, has been a huge voice for equity, policy, innovation, has also ignited a movement around a campaign for grade level reading across this country, and I imagine across the world. Ralph's been a good inspiration, mentor, and instigator many a times. So, Celinda? Okay. So, Brian, I guess we're going to give the car keys over to Kristen.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I get to talk first, Brian. Ann was trying to take my role. She introduced everybody. We wanted to start off by really getting a sense of the public opinion and the parental perspectives towards the solutions that will help children and their families succeed. And then we wanted to get a sense across the political spectrum of what we think the political appetite is and the political possibilities are, so that as we think about building the political will we will need to make sure that these solutions reach every child and family who needs them, what are the insights we need to keep in mind? So we're going to kick it off with Brian to give us a deep dive on the polling that we did in 85 states.
Okay, great. Thank you, and I'll, let me start by saying I'm, in addition to being a Republican pollster, I'm also a parent. I'm off to basketball practice after this, so these are issues that hit near and dear to my heart, both on the policy level, but also at a personal level. And so I just wanted to start with it. Just as I've learned as a parent and a spouse, everything's eventually my fault. So let me just start out with a couple apologies. First, and that is, I've been a Catholic my whole life, and so I often lean back on blessed and blessed talk. I know not everyone shares my commitment to the faith, so if I do lean on that, it's not. I don't mean to offend those who look at it a different way. And I also, as a Republican, lean back on we and us talk when I get in the Republican Party. I know we're a diverse group, so I started at the beginning. I've often gotten feedback that I say that, so please don't to be offended if I start with Republicans as we or us. I'm really just talking about me, but if you're a Republican, you're welcome in my book. So, but I will say, and when I was looking over what I was going to say when Celinda was coming in, this is what I thought about. This will work in? Mm-hmm. All right, so we did two things. Now, I was not in on the focus group thing, but Celinda was very generous to share her research, share her findings with me. We had a discussion about this. So I'll talk a little bit about the focus groups. I know she's with her sort of non-top schedule is just wrapping up a call now. But we also did an election eve survey, and I think you can read all this stuff and sort of gloss over. But the one thing I really did want to point out was this use of the Catalyst voter file. I am so jealous of the Catalyst voter file. A lot of times you can sort of, you have a client, you can lean back on one thing or another. Catalyst is really the gold standard for political polling if you're a left of center, if you're a Democratic group. This is, all the sort of best minds in the Democratic Party have gotten together. They've gotten this supercharged voter list We have a similar size list on our side, but this is this was really, when we looked into voter lists, and you want to use a voter list, this was really making sure that we got, real participants, real voters. People are really engaged in the process. This is something you can easily cut corners on. It's beyond the purview of most clients. But Celinda and her team really put forth the effort to get that out and to get us a sample that I think was very reflective and very useful. And the same, I wanted to point out on the focus groups, this was a real diversity. Sometimes you can try and get by on doing other things, but going to Denver and Philadelphia and Cleveland to get sort of three different perspectives, that Midwest, the West, the East Coast, I think that really helped a lot. We've done some national stuff, and you often do see a much different perspective in these. So for her to put forth, and the funders is to put forth, putting in those groups in three different areas, I think was incredibly valuable and really enriched the research in an enormous way. So to talk a little bit about the focus groups, and again, I think you can certainly see the key points there, but what I would say, the real big thing to take away is that this is a really key issue for a lot of parents. That they see the value in this, they see the value in these centers being quality. They see the value in you going to school to get yourself better, to this sort of two-track approach, and that this education ought to be something that's a valuable thing for your work requirements. And the child care, it's just so many parents, especially in these sort of groups we talked about, where they were, you have a child under 5, and I remember, I have my youngest are 8 now, I remember these times well. The child care is often a huge part of your budget, it's often a huge part of your family expenses, and that was what they heard over and over again in these groups is the search for quality child care is often one of the most consuming things you have as a parent, and it really often makes a huge difference on, what type of educational kind of work options you can pursue if you don't have that sort of available to you. So to look at where we were, and these are the polling options, and so we did talk very specifically about the two-generation approach to help people get a better job and to help them sort of move up in the workforce. And I think the key thing I would point out here is we're certainly at 86% overall, 75% favor. Even when we add in the sort of caveat on even if it increased your taxes, you're still at 74% off. Hey, 56% strongly. And I think, those are broad numbers. You don't find much agreement. We often have numbers where we'll have, you ask people what their age is. So you ask them if they have children at home under the age of 18, and you don't get 100% response. So to have this level of support and this level of interest in when we sort of lay out the two-generation approach, I think is a good broad starting point for us. Do you want to? You want to take over? All right.
Whenever it's good.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm moving on to the next slide. So.
Okay.
All right. So Celinda, we had sort of split up that Celinda would do this part, so she's better prepped on this part. I did okay, but you really nailed it.
He did great.
Yeah. So you'll really now get the better insights, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about the cluster analysis part we have, where we sort of segmented the electorate into groups about how things work best.
Right, thank you.
Oh, you're
so
welcome,
much.
Celinda. Thank you.
So sorry to be late. Yeah, it's great to be here. We don't normally fight over the data. Usually as pollsters, we're glad when the other side presents the data anymore. I mean, there's so much bad news, but here we have only good news. And we're excited to both be presenting it. And Brian has been very much an intellectual partner and a great partner in every aspect of this work, so thank you. So, to continue on the good news, about the story. One of the things that's very interesting is, of course, that America is uniquely polarized. You know that people are disagreeing right and left and perceive themselves to be disagreeing. And probably one of the most powerful aspects of this research that we can say is if you're looking for a bipartisan compromise in Washington, it's the two-generational approach. This is remarkable how universally and strongly felt this is. We could show you this data by region. We could show it to you by a variety of demographics. But we thought, since politics is on everyone's mind and polarizing, we would show it. And since people can't even sit next to each other on the plane, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, you can see here the true bipartisan agreement is on the two-generational approach. The Clinton voters, of course, overwhelmingly in favor of it. but 77% of the Trump voters in favor, including 60% who are in favor, even if it increases their taxes. And one of the things that's key about Trump voters is that they are economically insecure, blue-collar whites who tend to be very, very short of money. The majority of Trump voters say that it would be a major problem for them if they had an unexpected $500 expense. So these are very economically marginal people, and yet overwhelmingly, and perhaps because of that, overwhelmingly. Notice the women Trump voters, very, very strongly in favor of this approach, even if it increases their taxes, and white blue-collar men, overwhelmingly in favor as well. This is this is a table with a lot of data in it, but it is showing you here some of the priorities for the next administration. And you can just focus on that first column. But basically, the top priority, improving K through 12 education, and that is a very, very, very strong value right now, particularly promoted by women and people of color. But very competitive with this priority. And by the way, this is on a scale from 0 to 10. And these are the people that give this an absolute 10. And nothing's a 10 in America anymore. We asked a question last night in focus groups, what are going on with American values? And they said, we don't have values anymore. People are really down and out and tired of being down and out. That said, K through 12 education is a really strong value. But helping in children and adults in their lives get out of poverty, helping children and their parents get out of poverty, although notice even stronger with women, just to say the adults in their lives, making higher education affordable, although as much as we talk about this, very important to emphasize K through 12 too. People's priority right now is really K through 12. In terms of higher education, by the way, don't just talk about college. People want to talk about community college. They want to talk about post-college or post-high school training. People want a broad range. And by the way, for those of you involved in it, it does not test well to say free college, by the way. People think, yeah, that's great, and rainbows and unicorns are nice too. So it tests much, much better to talk about affordable or to talk about ending it without debt than it does, by the way, to talk about free. Investing in early learning and high-quality childcare. By the way, attaching the learning to childcare, much, much stronger than talking about childcare by itself. People still think of childcare as somewhat of a personal responsibility. They also think of it as something, how bad can it be? It gets better every year. And for the 2018 electorate, which will be a very old electorate, caring for aging parents is actually a bigger concern than childcare. And then allowing people who take time off to care for themselves or a family member. This is an emerging issue. It's not completely prioritized yet. People think it's a big problem. They don't know what government can do about it. So this is really an emerging issue. But in general, our point for today's conversation, excuse me, I have a terrible cold, is that poverty and getting people out of poverty is a high priority for people. Here is the variable, not just with the intensity, but by itself. Do you agree or disagree? If we want to make sure low-income children are successful in their early learning, then we also have to invest in their parents' economic well-being. 76% of people agree with this, 60% strongly. The Clinton voters are off the charts on all of this. They think of this as core values. They don't even think of this as policy disputes. But the Trump voters, including the Trump women, rural voters, who, as you know, are a key swing electorate right now, and white blue-collar men, all of them saying, yeah, this is a no-brainer. I strongly agree with this. And if anything, agreement has increased. The economy is not getting better in most people's minds, and if it is, it's getting better for a selective few, not for everyone else. And so, if anything, agreement with this policy has actually increased. Here you can see that people think the whole family is a new and innovative approach. And they also think that actually the parents will benefit even more than the kids, and that's a good thing. And they think that unless you bring the parents along, you can only have modest successes. That parents are a driving force for their kids, and that this sounds like an approach that will be successful for parents as well as kids. We asked the policy, we repeated this data from the agenda in the past that we had done in 2014, and we found that 3/4 of voters still support creating partnerships to provide services to low-income students who have young children and year-round access to financial aid plans for certificate programs. And notice, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all in favor of these policies. Republicans don't know that they're not supposed to be for these policies. They're wildly in favor of these policies. And as illustrated by the Republican that we get to work with on the policies. Notice the partnerships and the university piece down a little bit from 2012, but still very, very strong with the public. And one of the things is there's been so much debate about financial aid and free college and what's going on. It's actually diminished the support a little bit for these programs, because now some people think, well, is this code for free college? Because I just don't, I'd like free college, but I just don't see how we're going to do free college. So that's brought the numbers down a little bit. These are astronomically high numbers. If we had started out here, we would be perfectly happy. We would be backward somersault happy. But it is interesting to know that this agenda is interacting with the other debates that are going on out there. By the way, people think it's a no-brainer, particularly if you're talking about families, that you have to have financial aid go year-round. People think, and many of these things, people just think that's the way it works in the real world, and that's common sense. And by the way, both of those words are very, very popular with people, that this is just common sense, and this is the way it works in the real world. People think the real world's pretty harsh, but they think our policies should reflect how things work in the real world. And they think very often that policies do not reflect how things work in the real world. Do you favor or oppose making parents enrolled in college or workforce training programs eligible for state-funded child care subsidies? Absolutely. People overwhelmingly in support of this. Again, the Clinton people, this is a core value. It's like you had me at hello. But the Trump voters, the male Trump voters, the rural voters, the white blue-collar men, all strongly in favor of this policy as well, with real intensity. Just remember, when you're talking to a state legislator about this and they're giving you a bad time, the policy is significantly more popular than they are. Doesn't mean you'll win, but just remember, your policy's better liked than they are by a long shot. People are very savvy about childcare being a barrier to getting ahead. And in fact, what people think is you ought to start childcare support when you're looking for work. It shouldn't just be attached to the job. It should be attached to education, and it should be attached to when you're looking for work. Because how are you going to look for work if you don't have childcare support? So again, how does this work? What's it like in the real world? What's just common sense? And people think this economy has been marked by instability. So people are in and out of jobs a lot in this economy. They think that's going to be a fairly permanent trait of the economy. They don't like it, but they think it's a fairly permanent trait. So that's elevating the salience for everyone and the awareness for everyone about that it isn't just work, non-work. There's a whole context around work that people think is quite strong. So then we moved on to economic supports and human services. And we said currently low-income parents of young children qualify for government programs only if they work at least 20 hours per week. Do you favor or oppose allowing workforce training and education programs beyond high school to count as part of this 20-hour weekly work requirement? And people are overwhelmingly in favor, and they have been overwhelmingly in favor for a long time. 71% of people favor it, 55% strongly. And you can see here every single demographic, our base, the swing, everybody, the Trump voters, everybody is overwhelmingly in favor of it. Now, it is a little bit lower with the male Trump voters than the female Trump voters, 10-point difference, although we get a solid majority of male Trump voters. We don't have to get everyone in America to support us to have these policies be successful to begin with. And remember, the Clinton voters are there from hello. But one of the reasons why the male Trump voters are a little lower is because they don't want to be in workforce training and education programs. And many of them are quite nervous and in a kind of sad way, actually. Because what they say, women are like, Yahoo, I always want to get that degree, I want to get that new skill, etc. The blue-collar male voters who voted for Trump are much more, why can't I just get my old job back that I was good at? I'm not sure I'm going to know. I'm not sure I'm going to fit in the classroom. I'm not sure I'm going to fit behind the desk anymore. I put on some weight since grade school. Nice to have men worried about weight as much as women. That hesitancy there is not actually about the program. It's more about a trigger that actually has some kind of hesitancy for them. Health and well-being. Mental health. This is an issue that has totally arrived on the scene. Now, this is greatly ironic, right, for those of us who work in the mental health realm, because it is an issue that the public is totally there, and our system is decimating the structures, and people know it. Last night in North Carolina, where I was doing focus groups, people were talking about how homelessness is so attached to mental health. People are totally there on mental health. Current health insurance and Medicaid cover mental health preventive screenings for parents and children who are enrolled. Do you agree or disagree that mental health screenings and services would significantly benefit the whole family if offered to both parents and children at the same time? We have what we call in our business valence issues. These are things that are so popular that they're outside the policy debate realm. They're more like core values. This is a valence issue. The intensity is 69%. 83% like this. People don't even like the 4th of July this much, okay? And notice every single demographic group, wildly in favor. Look at these Trump men, look at the blue-collar men. Everybody's on board for this. Because people think it just makes sense to do it at the same time, and people are acutely aware of mental health issues. Men are very aware of mental health issues, including because of the veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is an issue that is totally there, and unfortunately, our policy system couldn't be further removed from it. The other thing that we've seen tremendous movement among people of color. It used to be that Latinos were very nervous about mental health, and they would say things to us like, well, unlike Anglos, we don't kick grandma to the curb, but we do shut her in the closet when she's crazy. So there was a sense that the Latino community hides mental health illnesses. This isn't something that we're going to be that comfortable with, taking every parent through a screening. What are people going to find? That's totally over. The Latino community has moved hugely on this issue, and very strongly in favor. And you can see here again, this just makes sense to people. People are short of time and short of money. Why not do it all at once? And do it when it's convenient. This is a family-friendly policy. Then we tested the impact of government. And we used the dreaded F word, federal. So we said federal government. State government is more popular than federal government, but when we asked people, do you think that federal government efforts to fight poverty have had a big impact, some impact, or no impact, only 19% of the people said no impact. 34% said worse, but of men, 40% said positive. Among women, who are much more pro-government than men, 54% said positive, only 26% said worse. But bigger, some impact, almost a plurality of people. When we look at, now this does separate the men from the boys, so to speak. And Clinton voters are totally in favor of the role of government. Trump voters are more negative about the role of government. That was one of the biggest determining factors of the vote. White, blue-collar men, the rural vote is too small to look at here, but the white, blue-collar men, more negative. So this does divide people more, but still, a plurality of the public says that the federal government has had a positive impact. And you can see here, more people don't know what the state and local impact is, but you can see by 45 to 29, people say it's had a positive impact. People are willing to have a role for government here. But what's interesting is that people don't think this is big government. They don't think of these policies as big government. They think of them as common sense regulations and common sense changes that we can make that just make sense for everybody, and that are 2-fers and 3-fers, because they will make things work better and they will be change, and everybody wants change. One of the things that's going on right now is you have America very divided. You have Clinton voters thinking very nervous about what change is, very depressed about the kind of change they're going to get. You have Trump voters very excited about change and the direction that change is going to go. This taps both of those because this seems like good change. People also, just remember that the number one word used in commercial marketing, besides you, is new. Nobody sells you the Tide your mother used, right? They sell you the new and improved Tide. America always likes the new shiny object. These seem like new things that could be done, that seem within reach, and that make sense. Let me turn it over to Brian to talk about the cluster analysis, which is fascinating. Let me also say one last thing. The other policy that tested extremely well was people thought that our current programs cut off too fast, that they should be graduated, that it makes no sense the way that it's all or nothing. You can make $10 more and be all or nothing. So that they thought a graduated approach made much more sense. And because people have themselves been in transition in this last recession, people are far more focused on what you need in transition than they used to be. So they think, maybe you need to keep the program for a little bit until you get into that job and really settle, just like you need childcare when you're looking for work, not just when you have it. So let me turn it over to Brian, and thank you, Brian.
So I have just a couple slides. We divided the electorate into sort of 3 groups. And so I think you look at, there's 58% who are the 2-gen embracers. These are people who sort of were all in on the 2-gen approach. Strong supporters of it. You can see, 99% were totally for it. Even 94% were for it when you told me you raise your taxes. This is sort of the core group, the group you can really count on. The strong majority. And I think as Celinda mentioned, there's an awful lot of coalitions, public policy coalitions out there that would do anything to have something that has, 58% electorate right behind it. So I think you certainly start from an approach where you have a broad and diverse coalition that has strong support. And when you sort of look at the demographics of this, I think it's sort of illustrated throughout stuff. It's certainly more women than men, more older than younger, more white than people of color, more Democrat than Republican or independent. And people who tend to have a positive view that the federal government and the state government can make an impact. And these are not necessarily just sort of people who embrace the government, but certainly it's a coalition that skews a little more female, and a little more left to center. So to look at this sort of middle group, the subdued supporters, who are the people who support the 2-gen approach, but aren't quite sold on maybe the federal government's going to be capable of doing it. What do these people look like? These are sort of, in our parlance, these would be your sort of swing voters. These are your persuadables. These are people you could get probably into your coalition, but they're not there now. And, this group it's more, notably more Republican. 42% of the Republicans are in this group. It's, notably more male. 50% of the men, 50% of this group is men. This is a group that, isn't quite sold on the federal government being able to make an impact. They've seen it make it worse or think it has no impact. But they are open to thinking, that the 2-gen approach could work. And so I think this is, part of your challenge and your opportunity is moving forward with these voters is, how do we sort of make this affirmative case that this is a policy that's going to work, that the federal government can, can sort of lay the groundwork for doing. And these are the people that will come along if they can be convinced, this isn't going to be another thing that just, doesn't spend tax dollars effectively or doesn't do things. Or doesn't do things as well as I'd like, but I think there is a group that's open to persuasion. And if you're able to get, 10-15% of these people and add them to the 58% of the people that were sort of solidly in there, that's an awfully powerful coalition. There aren't very many public policy ideas anywhere that have, 60-70% of the electorate behind them. And then the last was, there's 12% are these sort of questioning opposition. Who are these people who sort of, tax sensitive, they oppose the 2-gen approach, and again, I think these are the people that are waiting for the bill. They think they're less likely to be in favor because there are taxes. Even when you don't give it to them with the taxes, they're sort of in the back of their mind thinking, I'm really worried about who's going to pay for this. How's this going to get paid for? And I think that's, it's not that these are unpersuadable people, but that's a that's a hill that has to be run up with these voters, that they think, when they hear the government's going to come in and do something, and they're going to think, well, I'm getting a bigger tax bill. And that's, these are very fiscally conservative, very fiscally sensitive voters, and that's sort of where they are. And that's not to say they couldn't be convinced this would be tax savings. I think when you look at, a lot of the academic stuff that I know many people in this room have done, that, for every person you can get into the workforce and with quality childcare, and a child that grows up, in a nurturing environment that gets the first 5 years of solid education, that's worth millions of dollars down the road, and that person being a more productive member of society, and that person being less likely to go to prison. And I think that's, we're testing this, but I think that's the long range case to make with these voters, that it's, it's $1 spent today that saves $100, 20 years down the road. And I think, do we have one more? I'm sorry not to know. So I just think we had, this sort of, I think, reiterates the points I was just making, that, who are these subdued supporters? How do we get them? And I think,
You ready?
there is really this sort of focusing on the well-being of the child. And I think that's the point I was sort of making in a much more roundabout way. But I think there really is, the well-being of the child is really the key to sort of hitting through with these voters. And I think, I'm sorry not to, okay, but yeah, I think that's the last we had. I'll come back and turn things back over. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Brian. All right. Well, before we open it up for questions for folks, we wanted to get some reflections here, and we'll start with you first, and then move to Ralph. So just as you think about reflecting on this public opinion, and they're saying like these are the best solutions we could be trying to move right now, and you think about the political climate, what are some observations you think we should keep top of mind?
So as Ann said, before I came to AI and came to Washington 3 years ago, I had spent 20 years working for Governor Pataki and then Mayor Bloomberg in social services programs. So maybe I have some insight in how a Republican from New York looks at some of these issues, or have some experience at least in helping them work their way through. The first thing is, I think there is, the polling data shows it, and I think the president in his campaign saw it, that there's a great desire to do something in early learning and childcare. There isn't any question. It was one of the few things that they made a specific proposal. But I think that's going to come with, as well, a commitment to work and employment. The president, in his inaugural and in other places where I've seen him, has talked about moving people from welfare to work. And that is a sort of core belief. It's also something that, by the way, polls very well, that whether this poll shows it or others, if you ask Americans, do you think that cash assistance or benefits should come with some expectation of employment, they always overwhelmingly say yes. That leads you to the sort of the training and education issue, and that isn't exactly work, and people get a little tense about that, particularly on the Hill and among conservatives. I think a compromise on that could be an attendance requirement, that if there are in training and education, there's also an attendance requirement every day. Not you're in a program and we'll see you in 6 months, but we want to know, were you at that class or in that program tomorrow and the day after that. In addition, there will be a great talk of state flexibility. And I think here is also an opportunity for the two-generation movement. You can't, in social services, in the programs I've worked in, you can't serve the whole family if you're constrained by funding requirements from one program in food stamps and another in child care and another in TANF and another in Medicaid that all have their own requirements, and one serves the parent and another serves the child. So I think that you will hear a desire to address opportunities at the state level, but it will come with maybe not block grants, but linked funding streams or freeing up of requirements that keep funding in one program and not in another. And I think that's an opportunity. I also think there's going to be a big emphasis on employer responsibility. He's already started it. He is basically saying to these businessmen and women, I'm going to give you a pretty big tax cut, and I'm going to reduce regulation, but in return, I want you to hire Americans and hire and grow. And I think what comes with that is also to nurture employees, and nurture employees who are sometimes hard to hire. The guy coming back from prison, the single mom, the person who has issues with regard to family. And I'm hoping that that rhetoric extends to them as well, that employer responsibility becomes a big factor. So coming back to childcare and early learning, they've made a commitment on that. I think there's going to be, with some of the description I just described, some discussion on that. There's the child care tax credit and making it more refundable further down the income scale. That's a possibility. There's an increase to the child care block grant. In the world that I come from, I know social services commissioners in counties and states who every year have to make an assessment about what percentage of poverty households can have or not have and still get child care assistance. And that has been creeping downwards. And I think that the president's team and Congress will come under some pressure because of this commitment they've made and the polling data that's been shown here to do more there. But one of the big questions I think that they're going to have to face, and is I think an important one, is it for the poor or for the middle class or for both? And when the president during the campaign announced his original proposal, there was some pushback because it was a very generous tax policy for middle class and upper middle class families. And not so effective for people but the lower bottom of the income scale. They amended it and talked about a sort of an option to that. But the higher up the income scale you go, the more universal you go with some of these programs to help families, the more expensive you become. And I would say the less effective you become for the most struggling and difficult families to serve. So I think there'll be some conflict within the Republican Congress and within the Trump administration and within the country as a whole about, are we interested in evidence-based, targeted programs at people who are really vulnerable and really struggling in American society, or are we interested in a universal pre-K, universal program or tax benefit to families that go up to incomes, above $150,000 a year? And I hope that the whole thing doesn't break down over that because it is true. For those of us who work in the poverty space, there are a lot of families that are struggling who, for a variety of reasons, need additional attention in early learning and in the age space that we're talking about, 0 to 4. And I think we should, and I do want to say to everyone here, they know that, and this is an opportunity to get something good for those families. And I don't want to blow it by getting into a fight about universality or because one, that's the last thing, coming back to the politics. So I worked for these politicians, and so I was the commissioner who operated the programs. And every once in a while, they'd let me in the meetings where they were doing the political talk and they were writing the bullets of the press release. And when it comes right down to it, all a politician needs is a bullet that says, I did something on child care. That's what they want. They want to be able to say they did something. And I think they're going to get that. Mm-hmm. And the real challenge for this group and for all of us in this business is to guide them to get something that has the most chance to help the most suffering kids in the biggest possible way.
Mm-hmm. One follow-up question, just as Celinda was leaving the podium, she mentioned about the cliff. Do you think when the Republicans look at that, and I understand what you're saying about going higher up in the income stream, but do you think that they understand this idea of if you make $10 more, suddenly losing all of your benefits sort of sets you back?
Well, there are two things about that. It's not actually all of your benefits. So it's a variety. Some have cliffs at some point, and others don't. The one area where, when I talk to people in America and when I talk to parents in New York, the cliff is most pronounced is childcare. And so if, again, and I think the Trump people have heard this business about cliffs, and they want to do something about it. And I would say childcare. I would not say all benefits. I would not, because again, then you're going to, because one of the things about these cliffs is what you're basically doing is you're extending the benefits further up the income scale and increasing costs and less effectiveness for the poorest families. So, and of course, just, I'm sure all of you know this, but in Medicaid, the cliff alleviating function are the subsidies associated with the Affordable Care Act. So that's a big cliff too, and if those subsidies go away. So I think the focus should be on early learning, kids between 0 and 5 before they get to school, and childcare. And there, I think the cliff discussion is very, very useful. And one last thing, the conservatives who I talk to don't buy all that. I mean, they really get nervous about an over-obsession about cliffs and marginal tax rates, as do, by the way, Bob Greenstein and the people on the left. So, you know, there is a cliff, and it usually happens in families' lives when they run into the subsidies rule on childcare. That's a place where it happens a lot.
Yep, good. All right, thank you. Ralph.
Well, first of all, I empathize so much because this flying really gets to those of us who have allergies. As you see, I'm keeping mine sedated with multiple cups of hot water. So I'm grateful. I might need that. I'm grateful for that. When I heard Anne speak earlier, I was reminded of a story Gloria Steinem tells, and quickly it was that she was bored on a field trip, left the class and walked up the hill, saw this turtle inches away from the asphalt in the kind of a marshy bog, and she raced up to rescue the turtle, walked the turtle down this treacherous hill, freed the turtle into the river, and the professor says, "What did you do?" And she says, "I freed the turtle." And he said, "You know, it probably took that turtle a couple of weeks to get up to that hill to exactly that point where she could lay her eggs at a point where the hatchlings could make their way down. And after a couple of weeks, you've now..." And he said to her, "Next time, ask the turtle." And so I was delighted as Anne described, and this is so typical, and Mosley has described this work and this meeting, that the voices of parents are going to be in the room. And as I read and listened to the data, something else comes to mind, and that is a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill, wrongly attributed to him, but you can never go wrong by saying it's Winston Churchill. And the quote says, and I think the data suggests, that you can always count on Americans to come together to do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. And this, what we're seeing, is really an admission that after half a century of workarounds and end-around parents, that the two-generation notion that was embedded in Head Start 50 years ago, that it is no longer revolutionary, it is no longer weird, that it is now something that is the subject of considerable consensus across the population, because we had tried everything else. Now, I must admit that my own view and presentation this afternoon, comment, really is framed by having spent the last 5 years in 285 communities in 42 states around the country, working on the campaign for grade level reading. and having a chance not only to work with a whole lot of people, but having a chance to work closely with and learn from a group of more than 200 local funders, family foundations, community foundations, individual owners, quasi-public entities. And they have gotten, what they have in common is they've put a stake in the ground around significantly increasing the number of low-income kids who are reading on grade level by the end of third grade, and to do what's necessary. And they have come to this, to a realization that there is a large and growing number of children who are falling beyond the reach of schools. Beyond the reach of schools. And if we stop for a moment and think about it, it's a scary proposition. And if you really want to read something, there's a radio story piece done by a reporter, Linda Lutton, that's recent. Read her or listen to her piece as she talks about spending a year in a fourth grade classroom in North Lawndale in Chicago. It is a scary piece. So these funders are coming to grips with this inconvenient truth. And for many of them who were erstwhile policy wonks, that realization is bordering now on desperation and frustration, because they do not see, do not hear, and comprehend what set of policy solutions will actually rescue those children and bring them back within the ambit. Those are the kids who are so far behind when they start school that chances are they won't catch up, and the data shows they don't. These are the kids who miss so much school that they fall behind during the school year. And these are the kids who lose even more ground over the summer and return to school in September, 2 months farther behind than when they left in June. Any one of these would be problematic. And when you combine them in the same community, the same family, the same kid who starts out behind, falls farther behind because they're absent, and loses ground over the summer. The set of circumstances facing that kid feel overwhelming. So these funders who have come to view themselves more than funders and who are really interested in solutions find it a little weird. Yeah, they believe that there should be fewer cliffs and more slopes. They get all the policy conversation. But part of the survey, and I was hoping you'd say something about the government dysfunction piece, is that they don't believe or have come to a high level of disbelief that the system can work, that there's anything that they see that can rescue those children, because they are seeing now in real time with real kids that you have a large and growing number of kids who need 24/7, 365, two-generation interventions and support. And what we know about the institution we have chosen, public schools, is they're not 24, they're not 7, they're not 365, and they're two-generation only under duress. So they find themselves at a loss. And they struggle to figure out, how do we build a system? And it reminds me, when I started the Philadelphia Children's Network, our motto was, I think Bruce remembers this, help the children fix the system, right? And that still remains a big thing. So ironically, despite my pretext of being a policy wonk, I find myself leading an effort that has as its highest priority trying to make the system work, trying to figure out how we get something that is significantly more seamless, more aligned, more coordinated, that will take on the challenge of data systems integration, that will take on the challenge of revenue, braiding and blending revenue streams and funding sources, that will figure out how to find innovative ways to match and leverage public dollars, private dollars, philanthropic dollars, so we can do more in the sense of pay for success. And as we begin to work on this issue, the handle might well be Libby and Linda and Joan and Jacqueline's 6 years at the Interagency Policy Board. And it may very well be that effort of theirs provides a way to think about working across systems, working across sectors, across agencies, and on the intergovernmental levels to ensure the horizontal and vertical integration and collaboration that's going to be needed for this work. So we end up, in a way, not seeing a lot of the substantive policy proposals as really being significant enough, grounded enough to meet the challenges on the ground of the kids who are in the most trouble, and those are the kids who are falling beyond the reach of school. So let me throw that out as an invitation, as the watermark for the policy conversation. For those kids who we are losing, are these policy proposals, even when combined, sufficiently plausible, testable, and sufficient to actually change and promise to change the reality for the kids who are now most at risk and who seem destined and doomed to become yet another statistic in the story of intergenerational poverty? Zero.
Can I make a little point?
Of course.
I want to associate myself with, I think, something you were saying there, which was that if we put too much emphasis on the Washington scene, now we're all in Washington, so we care about Washington, we talked about politics, we might lose sight of the fact that there's just there is a lot of gains that can be made in the local sphere, and with programs that are run and properly evaluated and assessed. And I do want to say there is a lot of cynicism, obviously, about government, and it may be very much part of the administration's shtick. And if you're going to wait around trying to fight or overcome that and lose time when you could have been focused at the state or local level, you may wake up in 3 years and say, gee, I should have been focused at the state and local level, or the community level, or the program level. And so I always want to, though I come from that government world and that's what I've done, I always want to be clear that it can be really frustrating and really slow, and a lot of good things happen in one program that's well run in Cincinnati or New York or Chicago. And I know there's a lot of people here who are in this world, and I want to encourage them to stay focused there too.
Let me use that to do the 30 seconds, if I had not been totally imitated.
Yes.
Some of you in this room are old enough to remember Margaret Dunkel's spaghetti chart. And what Margaret Dunkel, when she was at the Institute for Educational Leadership, showed is that the fragmentation, which we now politely call silos, starts at the birth of many of these policies in the subcommittees, in the House and the Senate, and essentially over time really morph into something that becomes the sort of the battle-hardened, weaponized silos that we decry. And so in many respects, I want to associate myself with your remarks that we have to really pay attention to local implementation and state. But in many respects, I think why there are kudos for the Interagency Policy Advisory Board and the work, the tough work that they did, is really that we need to start where the problem starts. Yeah. And the problem in many respects starts at the federal level. We need to understand that we may not be able to fix, de facto, all these subcommittees. But once that policy moves into regulations, we need to have an infrastructure that can essentially make sense, a kind of a sense-making infrastructure that allows for a sort of one-stop, fast-track action to make it possible to realize the benefits of the program. There is no reason why Head Start and WIC and community health centers cooperate as exceptions and not the rule. There's no reason why that should happen, but for the fact that we're not doing enough at any stage to create the conditions where cooperation and collaboration is the norm and not competition and resort to privacy shields and the like. That's the challenge that these local funders essentially want us to take up to make it possible for them to do well.
All right. Lots of food for thought. Let's open it up to the room. Either if you have a question for the panel, something about the public opinion, parents' insights, or yourself have an insight. Yeah. Wait, you have to say your name. You know how to do this. Come on now, y'all.
Andy Curley from Chicago Comics. We talk a lot about child care and early learning. While child care is a funding stream, it's also an action. And so many people, when they hear that term child care, equate it synonymously with babysitting. And wouldn't we get a better bang both from a policy standpoint and a public standpoint by talking about childcare as extended early learning? Because then we could tackle the qualifications, because as you just said, we know that these children need more education, but the qualifications around when you qualify for childcare funding are about the hours that you work and how much money you make, not what the need of the child is. And wouldn't from a public and policymaker standpoint, we can make a bigger point by calling it extended early learning?
Well, you know, my colleague at AEI, Catherine Stevens, has tried to help me with this distinction, and I've listened very carefully, and I'm not sure I mean, I get it, and I understand that not all child care is the same, or as effective, or as high quality. So I acknowledge that, and I think talking about early learning does help focus the mind on the potential to make interventions that make a difference in very young children. The one thing that is a little bit of issue for many people in Congress and many people in the country is that is choice. And there will be a discussion in the effort to provide additional resources for struggling families in the area of early learning or child care about whether we want to make sure that parents have choices that they can make. And sometimes when we get into early learning and high-quality child care, there are some folks who take that as a precursor to limiting the way in which resources which are provided can be used to only programs that meet a certain criteria. And while there is a good argument for that in some cases, you run into strong resistance with families that just would like to be able to make their own choices about early learning or child care, you know, with their family members or their you know, friends or people who they feel can take care of their children. And I think people in this world that want to run right by that need to be conscious that it's a legitimate concern among households and families that they would like to be able to make their own choices. The other thing, by the way, is that, as my other colleague at AEI, Angela Rashidi, has shown me, is that there's a lot of people that need assistance with childcare in non-standard work hours because of the way in which the labor market has changed. And that's not always going to be, an early learning facility, 10 o'clock at night, for instance, and so, there's a role for that too. And so I just, that's what I see your point, I know where you're getting at, but I want you to be conscious of these other concerns.
I would add to that, the language, and we could test it again, the language childcare as extended learning doesn't test very well, as extended early learning, actually doesn't test very well for some of the same concerns that you raised, so that people want childcare when a child is sick. People want childcare, they want play in childcare. Now, we could argue play is learning, but when you say extended learning, people think extended also means more hours. So then the childcare provider is raising the kid instead of the parent, and some parents don't like that. So it's better to not say extended, it's better to say and, childcare and early learning. That also sounds like, and this is particularly important for communities of color. A lot of communities of color want extended family as part of the childcare providers. They also think of these as community jobs, and then when you're saying extended learning, then you're moving it into facilities where maybe some of the local community people who've been providing the service quite well aren't hired anymore. So it works better, and early learning sounds like, well, maybe you bring someone in. So it sounds a lot more flexible to people. It sounds a lot more inclusive. It sounds like the kid gets to play too, or gets to sleep. They're not driving them. People cite Korean kids that they think 6-year-old Korean kids stay up till midnight doing math problems. They don't want their kids to stay up till midnight doing math problems.
Gloves are off.
So, actually that word just doesn't test very well.
All right. Other questions for the panel? Back here, and you have to wait till the microphone comes, so do not speak before it comes.
Or she cuts you off even if you get the mic.
So, Cliff Johnson, National League of Cities, question about the polling results.
I think you turn that on or pull it up.
It's on.
We can hear.
Okay, a question about the polling results. Do you have any evidence about the intensity of respondents' feelings on these issues? I think we all know that if elected officials believe that these are not the issues that are going to determine whether someone chooses to vote or whether it influences who they vote for, they're not going to care about these results. So it really comes down to a question, is this high enough on enough people's priorities that it influences their voting behavior?
So 3 things about that, and Brian should jump in here too. One, and I was going through it fast, that strongly favor is one measure of intensity. So the fact that all of these policies had such strongly favor do sound like, is one indicator. We have asked, not as recently that I can remember, but we have asked, would you vote these issues? And people say they would vote them. The biggest problem we have is that people don't believe anybody's on the other side. And people have a really hard time differentiating a good policy from a bad policy. And I'm not even going to get in any judgment about it, but like in the focus groups we were doing last night, people were saying, well, Ivanka's for childcare, Trump's for childcare, we're going to have childcare. And I presume we have a variety of opinions in this room about whether that's a good plan or a bad plan. I don't have any opinion on it. But that said, real people can't differentiate whether it's a good plan. It's childcare. It's not just the politicians who want to check off the box and say, for childcare. The voters are like, well, we did childcare, so let's move on. And particularly because, you've only got 41% of voters who are parents of children under 18. You've got, parents who need these services are very unlikely to vote themselves. And then you're heading into 2018, which will be an older electorate. So the short answer, somebody said to me right after the election, how are they going to possibly be able to do away with ACA? And I said, well, 22 million people who don't vote is one way. People on ACA who got on ACA aren't voters. We didn't even register many of them to vote. It's a complicated onion that you raise, but you're right. But the biggest problem we have is that voters won't perceive their politicians to be against these. Like, who's the villain here? I mean, if you're against clean air or something, well, maybe you're on the side of a chemical company that gave you a $10,000 contribution. What, a little kid gave you a $10,000 contribution to keep out of the early learning program? No. I mean, who's on the other side here? Stupidity's on the other side maybe, but who's against it now that it's on the agenda? So they're going to have a hard time differentiating. Why would anybody be against this?
Brian, did you have anything to add, and then I'll go to Robert?
I do, and let me bring up, thank you for bringing this up, because this was not one we had the data, but was one I put in the memo. There's really been a fundamental change in the way in which we vote in this country. In this survey and other surveys, a majority of people said they voted prior to election day. And I will tell you, one of the biggest headaches you go through with campaigns is, how do we get at these voters? What are the issues we can, get them at? And just in the same way, no one's really, if you're a hunter with a shotgun, no one's really coming to take your gun away. No, not even, even the most ardent gun, control opponent. And I think that's the thing, is if you can get enough of these voters who say, this is a fundamental vote deciding issue to me, and if you put a piece of mail in my mailbox, or you can show me you've made real progress on this, that's an incredibly valuable piece of information for campaigns, because they're out looking for, how do I get in these voters' mailboxes? How do I get in their email box? How do I get in on their phone, and give them something that's going to motivate them to vote? And when they vote early and vote for me. And this is really, it's something we weren't doing 10 years ago. 10 years ago, voting early was, for old people and people who mail stuff in. And now really, the majority of people are voting this way and looking for, and there's politicians, campaigns all over the country, looking for ways, how do I get at these people so that I'm not waiting until election day to try and find out what's the issue I can sort of lever them with.
In most of these polls, and I think in this one as well, they do have a question about what are the most important issues to you. And it is true, early learning or childcare doesn't show up as one or two. But one that does is the economy and jobs. And if you can associate what you're trying to do as being helpful to an economy or jobs agenda, and frankly this could be and is, then you're at that intensity level, especially with the politicians who want, that's what the administration is going to be judged on. And if we can find a way to make arguments on this issue that echo arguments on strengthening the economy, getting more people into work, increasing labor force participation. Just FYI for all of you who want to know about what Republicans care about, labor force participation. They think a lot about that. And frankly, better early learning and child care policies could help bring people into work.
The other issue that's right behind the economy and jobs, and your point's very well taken, is reform. People want reform in government. And the other thing I would say, and I've said this before, we have, as we speak, 41 mayoral elections up this year. We have 36 governor's races up next year. This is the kind of reform, can do, make sense kind of agenda that a mayor or a governor likes to run on and is part of a bigger package. So that's a great way to enter this too, is to get this into the governor's economy. The president may not be talking about it as much, or maybe he will, but a governor, a mayor would love to have this kind of stuff in their economic plan.
Okay, we're going to come over here, but you have to wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you all very much. I'm Michael Stubbs. I'm with the California Head Start Association, but I also chair the board of a reentry program for formerly incarcerated people. So looking at this from the two sides of the equation that I interface with, Head Start folks are, irrespective of who won the presidency, are concerned about the sequester, which is a default, and block granting. So it's interesting to hear that Head Start is a no-brainer for most people, and look at the data, and apparently that it speaks to that. And nevertheless, how do we translate that to our Congress to say, fund it. It's important that we fund this vital program for many people, not just Head Start, but in particular Head Start. I have a follow-up about the president's quid pro quo around a tax cut and employing formerly incarcerated people, because I had not heard that before. Is that actually a policy?
I'm trying to make it.
Okay, good luck. Good luck. Thank you. With that, thank you very much.
Sounds like you have a fan. Let's answer the question though first about Head Start. So any ideas here on how to translate the popular support for Head Start to deal with the sequester? Ralph? Robert?
So let me first address block granting. There is a lot of concern about block granting, and I think it's important to know what we're talking about block granting, or what is being talked about. One of the concerns is around SNAP or food stamps. I don't think that's going to happen. The Ag Committee, controlled by Republicans, wrote a report that was very positive about the food stamp program as it currently exists, wants to make some changes, but doesn't want to make a fundamental change as big as that. I could be wrong, but I think that's a fear that isn't something we have to worry about right now. Medicaid is another question. And there are lots of programs that affect young children that Medicaid funds. And I think that's a concern because the financing of Medicaid, I know this from New York, rewards states for spending more. And that's causing a fiscal problem for the country. I think that'll be a huge fight and really difficult and painful and hard to achieve. But that is something that is a legitimate worry for those who are worried about block granting. The Head Start, I have not heard a significant talk about a big change in the financing Head Start, but I might not know. But the people I talk about with like what's high on their agenda concerning low-income children and block granting, it's usually about food stamps, which I don't think is going to happen, or about Medicaid, where there's going to be some discussion of it.
My hesitation, as you saw, in responding to the Head Start question, is because I believe that we ought to be out there now, and we should have been out there already, saying that we want Head Start fully funded to cover all eligible kids as a full-day, full-year program. Within the progressive community, and within this room, there is a diversity of opinion on that issue. And as a consequence, because the diversity of opinion silences some of us, we do not have as affirmative, as assertive, and as politically powerful a position as we need. Now, that's the truth about Head Start, and it really is an invitation for in-community, amount advocacy, and it calls for a conversation between and among us, and that's a conversation that has been deferred, it's a conversation that's been delayed, and it may be a conversation that is now becoming increasingly urgent.
Let's go back here. Yeah, I see a hand. I know, you are the best behaved crowd I've ever had.
I'm a fast learner. Hi, Barb Faber from White Earth, Minnesota, White Earth Reservation. The Child Care Development Block Grant, when it first came out over 20 years ago, and I was around, and a few of us in the room were around when that came out. And when it first came out, it was to support the workforce, to support employment and training programs and families. Over the years, and then especially with reauthorization, it's taken another turn, and I get what you're saying about attaching it to early learning, because there's leaders in a room like Linda Smith, Shannon Rudisell, Joan Lombardi, who have helped make that happen for childcare. And I was a former National Indian Child Care Association chairperson for many years and spent a lot of time in DC talking about childcare and having to inform and educate our legislators, their staffers on what childcare is. I mean, it doesn't, everybody needs childcare. Everybody in this room needed it, whether every community needs it, whether they're on subsidy or they're self-paid. So, and we always had to remind them that it's, with childcare, when your child is in childcare, they're with that teacher, and I call them childcare teachers. They're with that teacher more waking hours than their parents. So when you talk about raising your child, of course, it's, your childcare, the parent is first, but the childcare provider is very, very critical. And so, having work with childcare, they work year-round. They get very few benefits. They're not supported as some of the other early childhood programs. So I think the importance of coming to Washington, D.C., but also talking to foundations and funders and policymakers about what really childcare is. It's a service to communities. You can't have a successful economic development without it. You need to have successful economic development. You need to have housing, jobs, childcare, and transportation. So it's part of a critical foundation. So I think with this administration especially, we need to do a really good job of educating and informing this new administration about how important childcare is to every person in the community.
Can I agree with that?
Thank
Agree
you.
with that. It wasn't a question.
I was going to say, that was an insight, very well.
Yeah, I mean,
I think, though, maybe the thing to answer is you particularly mentioned we really need to bring this to the economy and jobs. And I think a point that was just made was this is really also about community health. Like everything isn't always just a job. So it is about community health. And even Celinda mentioned people wanting to make sure that their families and others might be seen as formally as caregivers or other things. Is there a way, and Ralph, you might have some ideas about this too, that as we try and get people to understand sort of the breadth of what childcare means to society, is there something to do here, or is it really like you're saying, you know what, it's going to be about jobs and stay focused on that?
The reason why I don't think it's just about messaging, though messaging is important, is the messaging has to counter what is an established mental image. And for a whole lot of people, what could be so hard about babysitting? That the babysitting is still very much alive and well as Matt Melmott falls on the ground, right? That's very much alive and well. So in a state that will not be named but looks very much like Georgia, there was this moment when there was going to be a significant cut. And what some folks did was to invite the senior staff of the governor to visit a really good educare center. And they were amazed. Now, magic didn't happen. They didn't sort of go back home and change everything, but they went back home and changed some things. Because for them, the ability to see what high quality early learning looked like was really profound. And the contribution of Educare and other high quality programs is we've got something to point to. And we don't do enough on an ongoing basis to make sure that people who are making decisions really know and understand and come to see and feel and appreciate what it is we're talking about. We're assuming that we're going to win them over just on the messaging, and that's not true. We've got to win them over with real life experience, and that network of educare centers across the country is probably a pretty powerful argument for changing minds about what early learning could be, why it's important, and the contribution it can make.
Yes. I mostly like to move the microphone person really far.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Stewart at Futures Without Violence, and I wanted to ask your advice on addressing intergenerational trauma and violence as some of the root causes for why so many young families, the young families we care most about, are in the state that they're often in, which is often a single young mother, often intergenerational trauma, exposure to violence, and we know these kids who are the ones falling most behind, starting the most behind, are often the kids who are already have an ACE score of 6 by the time they're 6, and that's often the distinguishing feature of these kids. How do we help make the case that addressing mothers' experiences of violence, kids' experiences of toxic stress and violence is important in this work? And how do we address what we often experience about the very harsh judgment of young mothers? And we struggle constantly to try to tell the stories of truly heroic young women who go to the ends of the earth to support their kids, and often are faced with policies that seem to be enormously harsh and judgmental towards them. So would welcome your advice and guidance. The mental health results seemed hopeful, but if you have other thoughts.
Ralph.
One of the things that wasn't covered is really the deep ambivalence that exists about low-income parents. And it may very well be that a lot of folks really who care very much about kids think that the parents aren't good enough for their kids. The parents aren't smart enough, the parents aren't skilled enough, and the parents don't care enough.
Yeah.
So that ambivalence is there, and it's been there for a very long time, and there's no sense that it's going away. And I think that underlying some of this really good news is the bad news about the continuity of the ambivalence. And those of you who don't know Pam Cantor's work ought to take a look. And there's really great work in the country about trauma and stress and what's happening with kids. And it's really not just about violence, and I don't want to say that violence is that the lives of so many kids are so affected by the adversities associated with poverty that their life chances are being significantly constrained even before they get started. And that's really an important thing for us to take up. And I've been following this whole literature, and I say following because I've been learning about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and what we all need to do to get smarter about it and to figure out how we integrate concerns about trauma into all our work. So I don't have any real specific advice, but look for people like Nadine Burke-Harris and Pam Cantor and Josh. These are the folks who've been thinking about this for a while, and I think that what I see is they're beginning to surround the issue and beginning to give us some tools that we can use better to understand it and better to respond.
So I may have a slightly different take on this, because we've been getting along so beautifully. So
go ahead and spoil it. Go ahead and spoil it.
So are you all right over there?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you. I've got it.
This goes to the sort of choice between a large-scale universal approach and a targeted evidence-based intervention for the particularly vulnerable. And I think there are examples of interventions. Nurse-family partnership is one of them that has made some had some good findings, and that if you focus on those and on your expectation that someone in power wants to invest in things that have evidence of success in helping vulnerable children, I think you can make progress. And I think finding those programs that have been successful in targeted ways for the most troubled or vulnerable and showing how they succeed can lead to getting support for the issue concerning violence in children's households. I should also point out that the trauma and the difficulties that families face and this is where the controversy comes up, so get ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, but we also have to sum up, so it's gotta be short controversy.
While it's related to poverty and it's related to race and it's related to the economy, it's also related to a parental absence and the extent to which children are raised in households without the benefit of two involved parents there for the long haul. And you don't have to believe that, or you don't have to believe that the evidence shows that, but people in Congress do. And if you're going to try to win support for programs that intervene in these households, it's not a bad thing to say that you recognize the importance of family, and that when family's not working quite right, we all ought to want to intervene and help make those families stronger and wholer. And I think that is not to say that we're looking down on people's parental abilities, but we're recognizing that in most cases, all other things being equal, two active and involved parents are better than one.
Agreed.
So
Wait. I'm getting the zero. I'm getting the big zero. Okay, we're gonna end on the agreement. We're gonna end on the agreed. They're telling me zero. I'm so sorry. Anne's inching in. I want to thank this panel. They gave us a lot of good insights.
Thank you.
As I turn this over to Anne, I would just say some big takeaways are this seems to be there's a lot of tailwind behind this issue that you all can take advantage of. At the same time, while policy leaders are going to want to check the box, you will have to check in on quality. And it still sounds like we've got a lot of mental mind maps, stigma, and stereotypes we will have to deal with in these fights ahead. So I'll turn it back over to Anne to close us out for the day. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're not going to be closing out. So just we're going somewhat family style. Everybody wanted to be here in the room, and we're going to put out all sorts of ideas. But we are going to segue. We're going to de-mic you all right now. Thank you so much. Senator Martin Heinrich is here from the Hill. As you can imagine, is extremely busy on the Hill, and so he wants to so 5:30 be with us. So I wanted to just transition us a little bit. And on this panel, thank you so much, Celinda and Brian, for bringing in the pulse of the public, the parents, Ralph and Robert for bringing your broader perspective and opinions and insights in. We appreciate that very, very much. And Kristen, thank you so much for keeping it rolling. I might have missed some of the tail end, but it sounded like it was just getting interesting. It's a great time to bring Senator Martin Heinrich up to resolve the issues. But good for us to have a chance to raise different points of view. Okay, great. So, we just came out of conversation, polling, politics, policy. Just one thought I had from the beginning of that conversation going into this one is I think sometimes we fall into the false paradigm of it's all about a bureaucracy or a government answer, or it's all about the bootstraps and it's the individual on their own. And, a lot of times I think we try to do in our policy work, how are you creating the right conditions? How are you being really respectful and relevant with your services and your strategies and your policies? But then how are you lifting up families and their strength and their resilience? And so just kind of bringing that lens into the room I think is important. I also, when we think about polling and sort of how do elected leaders step up, sometimes I go very old-fashioned. I still think there's something to be said for doing the right thing because it's the right thing. I don't think that is lost, and I don't think we should give up on that. I've actually, when I've been out in communities speaking, like Ralph, like literally hundreds of communities, I have not had a problem getting different and diverse elected leaders engaged. Part of it is how do you stay focused, how do you stay connected, and how do you really be about doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. So it's sort of with that pleasure, or that backdrop, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Martin Heinrich from the great state of New Mexico. We've had the pleasure of working together for almost about 2 years, really with your leadership and the leadership of Susan Collins to explore the conditions, the challenges, the traps affecting so many families stuck in low-income situations without opportunity. And working with you, I have to really call out your dedication, your intellectual curiosity, your analytical approach. I think that's the engineer in you. But also at the end and the beginning of the conversations, it's always about ultimately caring about the children and the families in your community. And I just think we need to recognize and hold that up. Senator Heinrich was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2012. Prior to that, he spent 2 years in the House. Prior to that, he worked at the Albuquerque City Council, where he was elected by his peers to serve as council president. He has been a extremely well-respected and pioneering leader, especially in the field of energy, environment, public lands, conservation, sustainable development. He serves on the committees of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources, Armed Services, Intelligence, and he's recently the ranking member of the Joint Economic Committee. Martin is sort of always thinking about, if you think about his committees, you understand the land of New Mexico, the federal labs, the public sector, the beauty. And he's really been sort of out there on those issues, as well as always thinking about the middle class with a strong track record on everything from gender pay equity, reduced student loans, minimum pay. And so I just, raising the minimum wage level at the federal level. So he's been out there a lot of his core issues. And over the past couple of years, we've been sort of worked gently with him under, again, his leadership to really think about what's happening for those that are the most vulnerable families facing the toughest challenges. And then he's also done it very much with an equity lens. When we think of like a state at New Mexico that is majority-minority, minority-majority, it has 23 tribal nations. You have 19 pueblos. You have 3 Apache tribes, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Fort Sills, and you have the Navajo Nation. And so I think he's always going to be looking at the lens through equity, inclusion, intersectionality. And that's, I think, a very powerful piece, and also connecting to rural. With all of that said, that's just a little bit of who he is. I will give a shout out to the folks at Central New Mexico Community College, Kathy Winograd, president of CNM, who's also an Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow. They enroll 29,000 students per year with a 95% job employment rate in their related field. Sounds like they're doing something right there. One of her big goals also is to make CNM a family-friendly, family-welcoming campus for students who are working, who are parents, or for next generation. So I know they'd be shouting out to you, Senator Heinrich, in their support, and it's only because they're back home working away. So sort of laying all of this out, as someone who was really first, a lot of your early work was on environment and the economy. Tell us about your journey to think about children, families, and breaking the cycle of poverty.
Well, let me start and just thank Ascend and also Susan Collins for, none of this is possible without partnership, and certainly in the Senate, very little moves forward if it's not bipartisan as well. But a lot of my early work was focused on energy. I'm an engineer by training, a lot of Department of Defense work as well. But when you travel around a state like New Mexico, we have deep structural problems and a substantial amount of poverty and real struggles in rural areas, in urban areas. Having worked in places like the Navajo Nation, where I saw firsthand when I was out in the Thoreau area, people still haul water to and from their homes, don't have indoor plumbing or a well or a water supply, sometimes don't have electricity. It just, the poverty stares you in the face. And I had sort of racked my brain for a long time about what we needed to do that was different, how we could take sort of a 21st century approach to making sure that the young people I meet in the state could meet their potential. And time and again, as I started looking at this sort of two-generation approach popped out, I think part of it was the context that even before the most recent election, it was very clear that under the budget pressures we were under, there wasn't going to be some giant new infusion of public resources into a new program on poverty. So what could we do? And the idea of being able to take what we have but make it work better, I saw the potential for a real bipartisan attraction there, and to give people the support they need as a whole of family is something that really resonates in New Mexico. I mean, family is sort of the first value that I would articulate when someone would ask me about my home state. And so as I learned more and more about this sort of approach, it just made intuitive sense. I thought it was something that could catch on in the current, very challenging and polarized environment. And I wanted to do something meaningful and concrete and pragmatic around the kind of poverty that some of us struggle with in our home states.
Really appreciate that. And I wonder, I don't know if everybody sort of had a chance to read the Two-Generation Economic Empowerment Act yet. It was recently dropped, but for those of you that have not had a chance to see it, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about the content of the bill and what do you think is especially most promising in today's climate?
There's three basic parts to the bill. I think the first part is something that probably should have happened a long time ago, but it was good to put it in the bill and say this is something we should absolutely be doing, is taking the federal family of agencies and making them sit at the same table in a sort of intergenerational committee to address these issues and stop allowing them to be siloed in their separate agencies. Looking at how we can better seam those things together and make them accessible to people working across all of those agencies. So that council is a central part to the legislation. And then looking at encouraging, whether it's a city or a county or a tribe or a state, to be able to take different funding sources and seam those together and try to create that whole of family approach with real oversight, but also incentives, like not having a different report to every agency that you might be able to bring funding in. Have one report to all of those agencies that deals with each of their focuses. So that I think is a part of the legislation that has real opportunity to make a difference. I think there are a lot of, whether it's an educational entity like C&M that you mentioned, whether it's a local nonprofit. I got to see what United Way of Santa Fe is doing with this kind of approach, whether it's a county that sees this problem and wants to take a more creative approach. I think that's a very important part of the legislation. And then we have a pilot project for social impact bonding, which is one of the more innovative approaches out of there that we're just beginning to see the results from, and is on sort of the cutting edge. And I think it's structured in such a way that these three separate pieces are all there and they're complementary, but if there are opportunities to move one or another, it's very easy to sort of separate out the parts as well.
That's really helpful. And one of the things I'm curious about, I want to pull out, because when we were working on sort of beginning the conversations around the content of this work, it was very important to Senator Heinrich and obviously to the Aspen Institute that how this is sort of launched in a very bipartisan way. And, as I mentioned earlier, we're active in about 45 states at a practice and or policy or both way, and also with families and communities and local philanthropy. And it was really powerful when we talked to a lot of offices where they had action happening, but were supportive, but didn't necessarily the first person didn't say yes, and I think he'll be one of our best supporters later. But when we had the conversation, well, you did, and I followed up months later, but with Senator Susan Collins, I wanted to bring, she could not be here because she both has a sprained ankle and couldn't leave the Hill. He happens to be a marathon runner, and he's great, so he's here. But I really, she felt very badly about not being here in person and actually sent a letter. And I think she's someone, when I look at who on the Republican side is really kind of committed to bipartisanship, doing the right thing. She wrote a letter, and I just wanted to read part of it. I asked her, she asked me to read just part of it for you, her voice could be here in the room. And so in her letter, she says, it's time for a new approach. I appreciate the Institute's support for the bipartisan Two-Generation Economic Empowerment Act I authored with Senator Martin Heinrich, which would address the gap between our good intentions as a society and the ineffective results. Our bill would equip parents and their children with the tools they need to succeed, better coordinate efforts across government agencies, and encourage public-private partnerships to harness the power of philanthropy. Our bill makes an important step towards reevaluating our approach to poverty-reducing programs and promoting innovative, most effective use of dollars to lift families out of poverty. That's just at the heart of her message. She's someone who has a slightly sort of older population state. She has a high rural state. She has a rural impact 2-gen R&D site that I believe she has visited. She's sort of personally been committed on this journey and also has an educare site and thinking a lot about early learning and investing in people. And when we think about all the conversations that are happening, Senator Heinrich, I'm sort of curious how, what have the conversations been like for you and Senator Collins, and how do you see sort of moving this conversation, both moving this bill, but also more broadly moving the minds and discourse and commitment across the U.S. Senate, which is so important right now?
Well, it was interesting. I was not surprised that Senator Collins agreed to co-sponsor this legislation, because as demographically different as our states are, on a lot of other levels, they're very similar. They're very rural. There are real structural challenges to creating sustainable economies in those rural areas. She's very pragmatic. She wants to get things done. She doesn't just want a message about things like some of our colleagues focus on. So it was really a good partnership from the start. We had been able to work together on some other things. We share some committees, and I think it was a very good fit. I think our work going forward cut out for us is going to be to look at the Health Committee in particular and to tell these stories about why this is effective. And you notice that word effective was even in her letter. And that is a very attractive word for those members who want to get things done, and to have data-driven, effective programs that, in this environment aren't going to be bringing necessarily new federal resources to the table, but can produce results both for the children and their families, but also for society as a whole. I mean, one of the things that always bothers me is to look at a child who has so much potential and realize, because of whatever zip code they're growing up in, that they're probably not going to meet that potential. And the gap between those two things gets borne as a cost for all of us. And we see it show up in a myriad of different ways, whether it's the level of opiate addiction that we see in our country right now, the prison population and its size, recidivism, et cetera. Like, so many of those things need to be headed off when that child is 5 years old and really excited about their Head Start classes, or going into kindergarten, and having parents who are modeling the right things, who are trying to go to school and better themselves, and don't have some of the behaviors that then lead to those things being repeated over and over again. So I think we're going to need to tell the success stories, and many of you are familiar, you bring those stories from all around the country, because there are places where people are doing this now. And I think to take the stories that Senator Collins has from Maine, that I have from New Mexico, and I want to encourage all of you to leave your stories in the story booth while you're here, because frankly, that helps us take those things to our colleagues and say, hey, there's a better way to do this. And I really think, given the folks that are on the HELP committee, that we ought to be able to really add substantial bipartisan support to this effort.
That's great. And I'm sort of wondering, how do you see, I wonder if this has got to be sort of a thought question above everybody's head, thinking about the content of the two-generation Economic Empowerment Act, but then also some of the broader conversations that are happening around Medicaid, sort of responsibility between federal and state government and communities. How, sort of what are both your cautions or opportunities or key ways we should be thinking and or acting and being helpful?
I think first and foremost is telling the success stories from those nonprofits or those places around the country where this is working. That is first and foremost. And then I think also being a voice of caution that other things that we may do between now and when we're able to pass this legislation don't allow us to backslide. Making sure that people understand that a whole of family approach means that we have to make sure that basic things are there, including healthcare, obviously. And so that's also a place where I think voices from places where things are working, engaging governors who are making these things work in Republican and Democratic, red and blue states across the country, engaging other voices that will be received well across the political spectrum who are now bought into this idea and want to share it with policymakers at the federal level. Those are the kinds of things that I would point to.
Thank you. So I'm going to tee up, if people have questions, I have sort of two questions I'm going to ask together and let you answer them as you like, and then invite people to introduce themselves and ask a question of the senator if they would like. So we're trying to think a lot about what are new alliances of people in sort of leadership positions to help do the right thing. And there's so much activity at the federal level or at the national level. Policy really starts to play out in, life choices at the state level and at the community level. And so I sort of anticipate there's a lot of innovation and sort of effective implementation happening in the states that are using the two-gen approach as a strategy. And I'm wondering just whether there's any kind of opportunity to have a bipartisan group of senators and maybe bipartisan governors that could maybe form some kind of working group, because, we got to have outcomes guide this, but you also have to have enough resources to be effective as well as use them well. And so I'm just sort of wondering, what are your thoughts? I'm just trying to think out of the box about different ways to organize leadership, whether, kind of a group of governors and senators and maybe even House members might want to come together in some way.
I think it would be helpful to hear from governors, particularly what is working in the workforce lane around the country, because you can't do effective workforce training if you don't have many of the other things in place that support the family. If somebody can't, answer the child care question, they're not going to get the training that they need or the education that they need to get on that path to creating an effective workforce. And most governors realize without the workforce, you're not going to attract the kind of economic investment that you want to see in your state. So I think having that conversation in particular would be a real opportunity.
That's great advice. And then last one was on infrastructure. So infrastructure and the Democrats, I've not had a chance to read the $1 trillion Democratic plan, but it seems like just the shift, and we are very lucky to have Nobel laureate Dr. James Heckman tomorrow, who one of his fundamental points is human development is economic development, and investing early is going to pay off later. Good, just kind of common sense stuff. In the infrastructure plan with the Democrats and just big picture, is there a real kind of big dosage on early learning and on people and on childcare and on facilities? And if not, can we put that in there?
I think that's a very effective ask. I mean, it's it is largely focused on sort of bricks and mortar, but also with a focus as well on what does infrastructure mean in the 21st century, and that means things like broadband, so that you can get services, healthcare, education, other services in through medicine and teletraining into rural communities, into places that otherwise wouldn't be able to access those things, to make sure that business development can happen in anywhere in the country, and a heavy dose of also realizing that we haven't really invested in our infrastructure on the energy side of things as well, and sort of updating what does infrastructure mean today as opposed to if it was the 1930s and we were just talking about roads and bridges.
Thank you. Questions in the audience?
That you're doing, and many of the problems that we have in terms of some of what we call the silos and the stovepipes, et cetera, in the federal government really have to do with what's in law. And eligibility criteria that's different and recertification criteria that's different in these laws. And I wonder if there's any thought given to right now to trying to tackle that issue, especially in the social programs. Because, we've been faced with, can we do a better job with the overlap? And I know that GAO has given you guys a number of reports on this, but the overlap is really secondary to the issues of being able to align these programs in a more reasonable way. And that gets back to the authorizing language you guys give us or give the government, and making sure that there's some flexibility in the various agencies to align these things without being up against, violation of law.
And I think as we go down this road, I think we need to look for ways where you can meet the authorizing language outside of what has traditionally been required with a pathway for accountability and a certain amount of proving things work. So if you're able to hit certain goals, then you can have a waiver to what would normally be the authorizing requirements. And I think we need to build that into the way that we approach legislation and organizing these cross-jurisdictional programs.
Yoli Flores with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. There is so much evidence around so much of what we've been talking about, and Ralph in the previous panel talked about going beyond framing, and really helping legislators see in action great programs, bright spots, evidence-based. But even when we do, there seems to somehow always be a counter, whether it's refuting the data around gains for children that are in good quality early ed programs, learning programs. You'll get something about the fade out, right? So what might you share with us about what else the field needs to do to persuade, encourage, teach our legislators that what we've been talking about for so long that you get, but so many of your colleagues on both the House and the Senate still do not, especially around early learning. Yeah. What is your best advice?
I think it's a combination of a compelling individual story oftentimes, and preferably one from someplace they can't ignore. So if it's from their own district or their own state, that makes it more compelling to them. Certainly they want to see their home team succeed, combined with data that comes from a source that is hard to refute, and an understanding that you have a continuum here, and you can't do the first three things and then just give up and expect the data at the end of 10 steps to be good. You really have to carry the ball and hand it off from step 1 all the way to step 10 with a continuum. And that's what we can do a whole lot better without really adding a lot of new resources, except for some willing partners in the private sector and the nonprofit sector and other places that haven't necessarily been fully utilized in the past.
Other questions? Well, one question I wanted to add, and we talked about this earlier, and it's I think at the heart of how you work, and we've talked about it as a core principle around 2Gen, is the importance of public-private partnerships. And you have especially some very well-respected, fantastic foundations in the room. I'd give a little shout out to my friends over at the Kellogg Foundation who have really made New Mexico.
That's right.
I got to do it.
Thank you. I'm glad you're doing that.
But there's a lot of foundations here. The Kids Count with the Annie Casey Foundation is a fantastic resource, and many others here. But what are your thoughts around really leveraging public-private partnerships, whether it's at home state or nationally? And also, how do we get business and employers to really come to the table and incentivize that? So I'd sort of be curious, both employers and philanthropy, if you have thoughts about ways they can be more helpful or in this conversation.
I think with employers in the private sector, it's really good to engage them in the entire workforce conversation, which is very obvious to them in many cases what their challenges are, and use that as an introduction to the sort of whole of family approach that works, and then create with them, make them the advocates then for having this approach that starts with early childhood education and goes all the way through to making sure that these parents are in a position to succeed so that their kids can succeed. I think with the foundation world, I think it's really important to have to have a long-term commitment, and for foundations to understand that, if their focus changes every 3 or 5 years, we're not going to get the kind of results that you get when you make a decade or multi-decades long commitment that shifts in priority over time because of the data that you're getting back. But you know that there's this long-term partnership where the partners know that if they're making progress, they're going to continue to have the kind of support that they need to continue that progress.
That's great. All righty. Well, I think you've raised some really great points and requests of us in terms of how are we sharing up stories and solutions and connecting to the ground. And I think, how we can think more, and perhaps there might be some doors opening, and I'm expecting to hear from our next panel a little bit on maybe this infrastructure and other strategies about where we can be helpful in pushing in this moment. But, Senator Heinrich, you aptly raised, if we're not in it for the long haul, then these are not simple solutions. We're talking about bringing things together. We're talking, but bringing it through the lens of really the experience of a child and a family versus them fitting into the system. And that's really kind of turning the equation inside out. So I just, as you sort of I want to give you the last word, but I think you're aptly pushing on the workforce lever. We now are seeing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in implementation level. And one of the core pieces is childcare, early learning, or also different sectors like caregiving that we could bump up and professionalize. So think about that. And then going into your new role with the Joint Economic Committee, and we do have a Nobel laureate economist tomorrow, and if we can get you his information, we'd be happy to, but showing the ROI. But as we think about how we're telling the story even of our economics, because we've had, when we think about 2010, unemployment 10%, 4.7, household income way up, but yet, I'm getting the hook. Okay, got to let them go back and vote for good things, or for good issues. But we need to also track workforce participation more.
Absolutely.
And so I'm just sort of wondering, that doesn't come out with the monthly job numbers.
Yep.
So just I'll hush, but last words on. From you.
I think the last thing I would say is, I'm actually, in my role on the Joint Economic Committee as ranking member, one of the things we're looking at is the measures that we were not doing a very good job in looking at over the course of say 2009 until this year. It's really important that GDP goes up and that, you know, we see indicators like various index funds going up. But if people don't feel like they can retire with some level of security, if they don't feel like they're on a solid financial footing, that their kids are going to be able to go to college or at least get the workforce training they need to have a better job than they had, then we're not doing what we need to do. And having those sorts of measurements as well, I think, are a very important part of having an economy that works for all Americans.
Thank you very much, Senator Heinrich, and everybody please join me in thanking Senator Martin Heinrich for his leadership. We will for sure, for sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Give him help.
Just keep moving. Okay, keep moving. It's dynamic here. So Bruce, Aparna. Oh, they're gonna come one by one. Okay, sorry. I'm just getting my notes. So guys, we are moving right on time. And are you gonna? All right. So the senator, has had a chance to leave. I just want to really, I cannot underscore, I think you all get it, how literally insane, crazy busy it is on Capitol Hill right now. And for a U.S. senator to take a cab and come over and talk to us and go back, that's actually a really big deal. It's just one, actions and words, but I just, this is someone who I really think is committed in his DNA. And I know there are more like that. And I know that there are more that are waiting to be that. And the most effective way to connect with elected leaders is with what's working in your community. And so I think there's a really significant opportunity there. My partner in the Community Foundation world, Roxy Jurdy from the Sarasota County Community Foundation, was just on a big blitz move on Capitol Hill with other community foundations. Where how many people did you meet with, Roxy, would you say? 11 meetings in a day and a half. In addition to her philanthropic message, her core content message in terms of strategy and an area of opportunity was around really working with children and parents together. Let me tell you about 2Gen. Well, in our network, we were just doing some small polling. A lot of you do have lobbyists or public education folks sort of working on the Hill. And think about the diversity if we had people coming onto the Hill just to visit and just to share. Like, this is a program in Minnesota and what we're doing. This is what the National Center for Family Learning is doing. But just hearing it, because it's not about one organization, one voice, one solution. I think we have some other ways to sort of animate and activate the diversity of this network that is just telling the story and bringing people into the conversation in fresh ways. There are going to be some big battles. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm a mission-based girl. I'm old-fashioned. I really do believe in the right thing. God help me. I'm screwed. I'm kidding. Because I'm also a parent and I'm in the game. But I think there's ways that we're keeping on solutions. Don't be Pollyanna, but got to keep the drumbeat about what is possible, because the only time a revolution happens is when people think it's possible. And the systems were not working perfectly before. And so it is scary where we might go, but change can have real opportunities for children and families if we keep that at the center. So, with that said, we wanted to, today we knew was going to be a lot going on, settle people in, was try to give as much breadth to ideas and opportunities and perspectives. And so I'm really delighted that there are three serious policy rock stars that have very sort of different backgrounds and points of view and areas of expertise that I asked them to sort of, if they would be willing to share kind of a 5-minute rapid response on both kind of intel, insights, reflections from their day, but also kind of the core sort of area of expertise that they have. And so I'm going to sort of just introduce them briefly. Their bios are in the packet, and do that 1, 2, 3, and then then we're going to break and go into the reception and have a chance to just really informally network. Again, I cannot underscore, we've been sort of rolling pretty quickly here at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, just trying to keep up, as I'm sure you have. And we thought, let's just start the conversation, bring diverse people together, No one answer, no one perspective, but like listen, engage, and connect. So I was really just delighted and honored that all three of these folks were able to say yes and jump in. Bruce Leslie, who is the president of First Focus, is someone who's got Western in his blood. He's got local, county, he probably knows Capitol Hill inside and out, and has served on, with wonderful centers and strategic committees, and is someone who, whenever I think I'm stuck and there's not a way out, is one of the people, can I call, what do you think, Bruce? I think many of you have looked at his leadership and his expertise and his commitment for this area. So we're delighted that Bruce Leslie can be here from First Focus. Dr. Maya Rockamore, who is the president of Global Policy Solutions, is a new friend to Ascend at the Aspen Institute, but is an old part of the family here at the Aspen Institute as an Aspen Crown Fellow. She has deep expertise in health, social insurance, income inequality, youth and women's civic participation. She has had leadership roles at the highest levels at the Congressional Black Caucus, National Urban League, on the Office of Congressman Rangel. She is a former adjunct professor at AU in Women in Politics. So we're delighted to have Dr. Maya Rockamore with us. And then third, Dr. Aparna Mathur from the American Enterprise Institute. She is a resident scholar and economist there, also looking into the issues of income inequality, economic mobility, especially tax policy and labor markets, and I do believe is doing some deep dive work around family leave, which is quite relevant as well. So I'm going to invite each of them to come up to the podium, sort of take 5 minutes to shoot it out between your brilliance and the end is an open bar, networking, and some comments from Janet Fletcher. So your brilliance will be awesome, and I mean that.
Thanks so much, Anne. That little pressure there. So I'm a policy geek, so I thought I'd focus on some of the policy issues that I heard people talk about, and frame them sort of in sort of an offense-defense way. So first of all, just to tell you a real quick story, when I worked on the Senate Finance Committee for about 10 years, and one of my most distressing meetings I was ever in was we were talking about welfare reform. And you had all these senators saying, we must require work. We had a conversation today about work. And, we need 40 hours of work from these people who are getting TANF benefits. And so Senator Blanche Lincoln from Arkansas, said, well, then you're going to provide 60 hours of child care to people. And all these members who are older guys were fairly clueless about it. But it was an incredible, interesting dynamic to watch her educate them and get them to understand how public policy works, and sort of, people talked, Celinda talked a little bit about common sense, so how it really works in the real world. And so another thing I think about that came up today was sort of this issue around, in fact, Yoli brought this up, was how do we educate people? And I think that's where we're making huge progress. I think if you look at some of the debates, like if you think about where we were on early childhood 5 years ago, and think about even the issue around 2-gen, no one was talking about this a few years ago. Think about where we started on home visiting and where people were. So I think this education process is working, and I think that's a very positive thing. I think some of the barriers we need to think about ways to get around. One of those people talked about today was sort of the parent bubble. I think akin to that is this issue, the racial generation gap, and this issue of, if you looked at some of the polling, older voters, men, have poor voting or support levels for kids than other voters. And I think one of the things that's really interesting there, and I would love to kind of debrief with Celinda about this, but one of the things you're beginning to see is younger men are getting it. And so feminism has been huge for kids because it's educated men about the importance of these kinds of issues. And so you see men under the age of 35 being as strong as support levels with women, and huge gaps between voters over the age of 35 between men and women. So that's a huge thing about how do we bridge those gaps, but that should be a positive thing about sort of the demographic change. There's also this myth that I think is a huge barrier for all of us, and it's this barrier of everybody's for kids. Celinda talked about this. Is there really anyone against this? So it's really hard to mobilize people on our issues because they don't see the fight. They don't see the issue. And so how do we mobilize people to really fight on these issues for kids? Medicaid block grants are god-awful and terrible, so just want to say that. One major thing I think that works for us is in psychology, people are afraid of losing things. So one of the things we've been talking about in the kids community more and more is a sort of do no harm frame. So as we're playing defense, I'm really talking about the possible harm and unintended consequences of some of these policies. And the other thing, I think another barrier for us is this issue around the budget. The federal budget's a disaster, and so our investments in kids are declining. The Urban Institute did a report that shows like less than 2% of funding in the next 10 years would go to kids without change. So if you start thinking about things like Medicaid block grants, remember kids are the majority of people enrolled in Medicaid. They would be the most to be harmed by it. So that's a huge thing. The budget is a real barrier, probably one of the biggest barriers for us. On the offensive end, and I'll do this really quickly, this Invest in Kids frame, the great thing is Celinda really highlighted, I think, Celinda, you told me once that 25% of Americans hate everything. 83 to 10 on some of these things, right? Like on the mental health screenings. There's lots of talk about examples of success, returns on investments, and actually said it very well, so I won't reiterate that. There's a lot of conversation about big data, one step, and I thought Ann's question to Senator Heinrich does present us an opportunity and things around express lane, but this bill does a lot of those kinds of things, and I think we should really think about in a time where there's not going to be big money in investments, can we do those kinds of system changes and cross-silo things? Let's see. Also, other opportunities this year. So, we had a meeting in our office a couple weeks ago where everybody was completely depressed about what we could be doing. But there are two huge opportunities, and they are tax and infrastructure. So, if you're going to be providing huge tax breaks to corporations and other people, you have an optics problem. And so, one of the things we've had Finance Committee talk to us about is bringing forth an agenda for kids so that there's a little more balance to it. And then last, I think Senator Heinrich epitomized this, and we've watched some of the hearings on some of these nominations. We need to find more and more champions for kids. And so you guys have done an amazing job really cultivating Senator Heinrich. If you watch the hearings around Betsy DeVos, Senator Hassan was unbelievable in some of those hearings. She has a kid with a disability and really understands those issues backwards and forwards, and it was fantastic. And so really finding some of those new voices that can really work on our behalf for children and families. So.
Good afternoon and evening, everyone. I don't want to stand between you and the bar, but I do want to thank Ann and Marjorie here at Aspen. This has been a fantastic start to this great conference. And I just want to be able to start with the fascinating numbers that Celinda and her partner brought to us, because embedded in those numbers, I think, were some fascinating trends. Yes, everybody cares about kids. Yes, the two-gen strategy seems to have a lot of support out there. But as you actually began to get into the conversation about, well, who felt less enthusiastic about it and who felt the least enthusiastic about it, and by the way, I consider that category the opposition, it became wider, more male, more Republican, and over 50. Now, who fits that profile in the political scene right now? Everybody in power. Everybody in power on Capitol Hill, because the Republican Party controls all three branches of government. There's only one African-American man in the U.S. Congress who is a Republican and one African-American woman in the U.S. Congress who is a Republican. And so that just strikes me that, you know, the people who are opposed in the poll that Celinda shared are also the people who are in power. And so that means that we have to go deeper in terms of profiling that particular category of people to understand what actually is animating the nature of their opposition. Because I actually do think, because we can't just say it's men, because the black men were in the first category. We have to get at the psychology of white male Republicans over 50. And I have a sinking suspicion that the nature of patriarchy has something to do with the conversation here and the role of women in the public sphere. You know, the whole conversation over the last year and a half has been about making America great again. And that, again, it turns out, was pre-1965, maybe circa 1950. And the notion of women's roles at that point in our economy, we weren't in universities. We certainly weren't in the workforce. We certainly didn't have business and contracting opportunities. And there is a certain romanticization of that history, that a woman's place is in the home. And that means that childcare, why are we even talking about childcare subsidies? Because that is a woman's role, to babysit in the home. We are still dealing with the heart of the whole notion of the intersection of patriarchy, policy, and what we're dealing with now, which is a 21st century economy, where we actually have to rely on two family households who are earning, two members who are earning, and where we have to have work supports, not just for women, but also increasingly for men. And so it's important that we understand and get to that dynamic. Other things that I wanted to bring up had to do with the social construction of target populations. We absolutely cannot do this work without understanding the stigma and the stereotypes, without understanding how we actually stigmatize poor families, especially, and poor families of color especially. And the notion of who's deserving and who's not absolutely influences perceptions of who should get access to the resources that government provides. And we would be practicing a policy malpractice if we did not actually have that analysis in our work, because we're advocating to people who have a perspective, and we have to understand that perspective if we're going to actually craft the arguments that get us to where we want to go. And then I kept hearing this whole notion of, well, you either have a universal program or you have a targeted program. You have a universal program or have a targeted program. And there is such a thing called targeted universalism, just so you know. For folks who are doing public policy, you have to understand, especially folks who are doing policy that is relevant at the intersections of race, class, and gender. You have to understand that you can craft universal policies that have targeted policy levers that can get at the populations of concern. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and. And it's important for us to understand that there are strategies that can be pursued that can get you to both. And then finally, I just want to say, Bruce, thank you for giving us the answer that women leaders matter. We just had a whole march on the mall about that this last weekend. Women policymakers matter, and yet 80% of policymakers around the country, 80% of elected and appointed officials are actually men. And so we have to understand that when women are at the table bringing our perspective to the decision-making table and the stories that we can tell, it actually makes a difference with colleagues. And guess what? Running for office actually does matter. And so when somebody says, well, how do you mobilize people on this agenda? I'm just like, did you see how many women were out there on the National Mall this last week who have a natural interest in it, and the men that supported them out there on the mall? That is your army. That is our army. So let's get at it. Thank you.
That's a really tough act to follow. And now I literally am the only thing standing between you and the bar, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. What I heard today, I really loved the focus on the two-generation approach. You know, Maya said it exactly right. Why do we care about the two generations? Because suddenly there are many, many more women in the workforce. There was a time when it wouldn't have mattered. There was always the mother at home, and childcare was the responsibility of the mom. And now, decades later, 82% of families have both parents working. And so these issues have become front and center, and we need to have policies, work-friendly policies, family-friendly policies, whatever you want to call them, that allow women to engage in the workforce. So when I was listening to the conversation and to the polling data that came out, you know, we need to focus on the parents and we need to focus on the children. For the parents, looking at skills, training, education, I think is critical. What we've seen over the last few decades, the loss in jobs, especially when, you know, what we saw with the campaign, the loss in blue-collar, you know, factory jobs, the people who have been displaced from those jobs are the ones who are suffering, are the ones who feel like they have been left out of this economy. How do we get them back into the workforce through skills training? I think, you know, the reality today is we don't need to get jobs back from outside or from, you know, all those jobs that have left the US, we don't need to get them back. Even today, the manufacturing sector creates over 300,000 job openings every month. And when you talk to employers about why they're not hiring these people, why are these jobs going vacant? And they keep saying, well, we don't have people with the right skills. So the workers who lost those jobs had skills that were very different. They were operating in an economy that is very different than the economy that they're facing today. And so I think getting those workers back into those jobs, training younger workers so that they're equipped to handle the new technologies that come with these new jobs, I think is critical. So skills training, education is critical. We also talked a bit about the fact that labor force participation rates are low. And that's because, again, as Robert mentioned, a lot of that has to do with policy. When people come out of jail, we don't have good policies to get them back into the labor market. They lose access to a lot of benefits that other low-income workers get, and that sort of leads to the cycle where they're trying to survive, they don't manage, they go back into they go back to jail and they're not getting jobs, and so we need to fix that issue. When you talk about women's labor force participation, I think there's a ton of research out there saying, well, the reason women's labor force participation is stalling in the US relative to the OECD is the lack of family-friendly policies. About 30% of the lack of labor force participation in the US by women is due to lack of things like paid family leave. And that's an issue that's very dear to me that I'm working on at AEI in collaboration with people from other organizations, where there seems to be bipartisan support that this is something that we need to have a policy on. It's about time that the US had a federal policy on paid family leave. What happens currently in the US is that there are many families that simply when they have to take time off, they don't have any money. It's unpaid leave. The federal FMLA Act allows families to take 12 weeks off, but a lot of them are rushing back within 2 weeks after having a child simply because they can't afford to take that time off, and they don't get the support that they need. They're also afraid that their jobs would not be available to them, and so they're rushing back to work. And that's not the kind of policies that we want in the US today. It's we're a developed country. We want policies that reflect the reality that mothers are in the workforce. Mothers need to take that time off. That's important for the health of the mother and the child. So I think doing something on paid family leave is critical. In terms of childcare, we have both cost issues and we have quality issues. So when we talk about, we actually do a lot. I think when you look at the tax, the amount of tax credit programs and other programs that we devote to childcare, I think we have a lot of policies out there, but they don't work as well. So what do we do in the tax code? We have the child tax credit that helps families, that gives additional money to families with children. We have the earned income tax credit that's more generous to families with children, but the child tax credit is partially refundable. It's not fully refundable. The child independent care credit, which allows families to offset childcare expenses, is non-refundable, which means about 40% of low-income households really are not getting the benefit of these programs. That's money just going to higher-income, middle-income households and not really targeted towards people at the very low end. We can certainly fix that. That's something that we need to talk about and fix. And then in terms of the quality of childcare, we do subsidize childcare, but the kind of centers that families have access to are sometimes not the best quality. The availability of these centers is limited. As Robert pointed out, sometimes families need care not in traditional working hours, but in evening hours and late at night, and those kind of centers are not available. And so I think we need to fix that issue as well. So I think talking about the two-generation approach, looking at both parents and children and the interaction between policies that would help both is critical. Thank you so much for my time.
Bruce, fantastic comments to end us on and send us into conversations and connections. I just wanted to underscore for tomorrow, there'll be breakfast here at 8:15, and we start promptly at 8:45. At Aspen, we like to actually have forums where it's a round table and everybody is very interactive. The nature of this was so much interest and also just kind of connecting and getting ideas. It was a kickstart. So I appreciate everybody being flexible with this. We are going to have a more interactive overflow room because we have a bunch of people that have been outside in the overflow. So come early, share often. I, of course, will break the fire code and bring more chairs in, and then Margie will fire me, but oh well. There'll be a free chair. Everybody, there was such an interest in being part of this. And so just, really connect with others from what you've heard about where you're going, and we'll see you tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll be doing a deep dive on some of the recommendations that came out of a seriously robust engagement process, hearing from parents, hearing about real programs that have scale, some state innovation, and we're going to also hear from two sort of giants in my world that have been thinking about public will, innovation, really investing early. Some of my sheroes like Jackie Bezos, my boss Walter Isaacson, and JB Pritzker. So we're going to break, and at 6:15 we're going to have very light but really great comments from Janet Fretcher from the JB and MK Pritzker Foundation, who's been a great partner in this. So grab a drink, we'll chat for a little bit, and then chat some more.